Rasaprakāśasudhākara, chapter 11, verses 54 to 55. Tamre sapta gunam nagam vahitam punarhi tena tamrena rasakam saptavaram cha vahayet swarna varnam hi tat tamram jayate natra sanshayah. 7 parts lead are amalgamated with 1 part copper. Then likewise, one should amalgamate 7 parts zinc with 1 part of this copper. The copper will take on a golden color, without doubt. So this one is not really about making gold. It's about making a product that looks like gold. So this is Aurifiction, not Aurifaction. It kind of looks easy, the recipe, just 3 ingredients, lead, zinc, and copper, and a sort of ratio of 1 to 7, 1 copper, 7 lead, and also then 1 copper and lead when they're melted together with 7 times the amount of zinc. At least I think so. It says saptavaram, that could be 7 times. So it could be like you do it 7 times, but I think it's 7 times the amount of zinc to the copper lead mix. Yeah. So, but do you think we should, like, you would cast it in between, like you mix copper and lead and then you cast it and then you melt it again and then you add the zinc, or do you just do it all at once, or how do you think we should do it?
There's no clues given as to whether you should cast in between, so you're kind of leaving that a little bit freestyle. You can do as you see.
And so it's like in 2 different sentences, right? So it says sort of you melt copper into or melt lead into copper, and then likewise you melt zinc with this copper. So it sounds a bit like 2 separate steps, but you don't really know. So what would you think we should do for this?
We'll definitely start. The copper's got to be done first because it's the highest. It's got the highest melting point. So 1100 for copper, or just over 1100. So we'll melt that first, and then add the lead, which is obviously a very low temperature metal. I've never actually combined those 2 before, but I know they are used. There's some bronze. I know it's bronze, but there are bronzes that use copper and lead. So it has been done, and they do combine on some level, but I've never done it. So let's try that, and then when the ingot's cool, we'll reliquefy it and then add the zinc.
And do you think we would liquefy lead and sort of pour in the liquefied lead into the copper, or you just do the... No.
It'll vaporize on contact, well, not vaporize, it'll just liquefy and disappear straight away. It's such a low temperature metal.
Yeah, and I think then basically what this looks like is as if we were making brass, really. That's kind of what this recipe generally sort of reads like.
Or very silvery. It's quite 2 silvery metals and not much golden coloured. So, I mean, I reserve judgment until we've done it. Let's just try it and see how it comes out. Maybe you might be surprised. It might look like gold.
It would be very, very good if it did. And then I guess the remaining question would be whether or not, the ingredients should be used as is, or should we purify them or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of leaning towards purifying, just because that's how I was told to do everything. I know that we're differentiating between alchemical and medical use. So it's not actually telling us to purify, but my gut instinct is to purify. And I mean, maybe there's something in the purification process, because you're kind of shattering the metal when you do all these processes. By breaking it up, perhaps it allows them to bond better. I don't know. I mean, it's an unknown quantity, but maybe we could just do two batches and see how one goes, and then try the purified, non-purified, and then compare at the end.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The text doesn't say anything about purification, so it's not like shuddham nagam or purified lead or so. There's no mention of it. But on the other hand, it's not always stated outright. For me, the reason why I think there's probably no purification is that this chapter is not for medicinal use at all. So the whole chapter, none of the recipes from chapter 11 are for medical applications. But on the other hand, it's so normal to always do these procedures for any material. And in a different chapter of the work, we do have procedures for purifying these metals, which we can then apply. But I would go for, 2 batches, basically try out one non-purified, like start simply, and then do a second batch where we use the purified ones. But let's start with the unpurified batch and see what happens.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so that didn't exactly work out, did it?
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. No, I was immediately the copper obviously fine, but the minute the lead went in, I just thought, oh, it actually changed the nature of the copper quite a lot. It went from being quite very liquid to almost like a paste. The lead wasn't liquefying very well. It was bonding to the wall of the crucibles. Yeah, it was a real nightmare. So and then of course by the time I got round to I'd cast that first of all, And actually, when it was cast, it looked quite promising. There was some sort of strata in it that looked slightly reddish yellow, and I thought, oh, this might not be so bad. But the minute the zinc went in, that's when it all kind of went disastrous. So I think the lead had bonded with the copper, but it was preventing the zinc from bonding. And then, of course, the zinc, the minute it hit the air, you'll see it in the movie. It just obviously flashes. You get a sudden reaction as it oxidizes. So I can actually show you the ingot from the experiment, so you see it looks absolutely
it's sort of more silver. Yeah, it's sort of silver and dark. It kind of, from at least here on the film, it just looks like lead, really. It's sort of
basically like lead with bullet.
So failures. This recipe didn't work. Not the way it was described, at least. So where do we go from here? What would you suggest?
Well, just looking at the actual recipe, I'd reverse it. I would just make the copper the 7 times and put in 1 part lead and 1 part zinc. Let's just flip it and see what happens.
I mean, the recipe is really kind of unambiguous about the proportional amounts, right? So we would be really going off script here, right? So when I did have a look at other alchemical works, Rasa Shastra works, to see whether I could find a parallel recipe or parallel formulation, and I didn't really find an exact match. In the Rasarnava, in the Ocean of Mercury, I found a somewhat similar recipe, but the difference was that there was an added ingredient, which was iron. So that is a little bit different. So it also had zinc and lead and copper, but also iron. So it's a bit different. The thing about that recipe was that it didn't give any ratios. So it's sort of, even less information. But that, to me, kind of opens up this idea of us maybe just changing the ratios of our recipe. I don't really want to go forward with the Rasarnava recipe right now, but I think maybe you're right. Let's just flip the ratios and see what happens and see if that's any good.
It's an easy thing to work to because we've already been using those measurements. Let's just flip them around and try the other way and see what happens. I mean, my gut instinct that you'd think should be something closer to brass, because it's more it's almost like the 8-2, which would be a normal brass mix. So it should be a weak type of brass.
Yeah. Well, then let's go for it. Let's just try it. So how did this one work out?
Better, but no. In a word, starting to look a little bit more golden in colour.
Yeah, the colour looks a lot better. Yeah,
colour's definitely better.
Still sort of uneven, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you've got. You can see it where it's poured. It's very bumpy. It was kind of setting. It was cooling very quickly. It wasn't mixing so well, and also again, it's got those stratas running through it where it's not really mixing well. Even though I'd actually put a wet wooden stick in there and stirred it very quickly and agitated it, it still separated out into layers again. And the same thing when the zinc went in, there was a heavy oxidization. It was, the bright light and was burning away and making a right mess of the crucible. I actually took this and showed it to a friend of mine who's a bronze caster, and I just said, look, and he sort of grimaced when he looked at it and said, the reason you've got all those holes in there is because you've got oxidization. So he recommended putting something on the surface. He said normally when he casts bronze, he'll put charcoal, deliberately put charcoal on the surface of it. And when he pours, they just put like a little bridge in there to catch the charcoal, and it allows the material to pour without oxidizing. So he'd reminded me, I'd done a small event with him, and I was trying out something from a Rasaprakāśasudhākara book where the author had recommended putting gunja seeds, the little, the ractica, the little red seeds with a black dot on there.
Jacurity bean, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah. So
do you have some? Can you show us?
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
Often used for sort of bangles and jewelry and stuff like that. They're very hard, and they're surprisingly.
And so, how do you use them? What do you do with those? So use them instead of what he's saying about the charcoal. You would use those beans instead.
So the idea is that you just heat the liquid metal up in the crucible, and then when it's actually liquid, then you pour in sort of a cupful of these beans. They'll naturally float on the surface, and they'll all kind of butt together. Like sometimes you see those reservoirs and they'll put those plastic balls on the top to keep the water clean. So it's the same idea that all these beans will float on the surface and stop the oxygen getting to the material, and you can get it really, really hot. So
but copper doesn't copper take 800 degrees to actually melt? So wouldn't they just burn?
It's a little bit higher, so it's about over 1100 for copper. So these actually surprisingly heat resistant. I mean, I was amazed when I did it last time how well they resisted the heat. So I'm not really worried about them disintegrating. I think they'll hold their shape. So
okay, that would be very interesting. I mean, this is really a departure from our recipe, but otherwise would you I know, right? But would you do the same thing otherwise? I mean, just same ratio, same amounts, same sequence, or so just the same thing but adding these beans, or what would your plan be?
I think we'll stick with the same amount of copper. I'll probably reduce the amount of lead and the amount of zinc, because if anything, there's still too much silvery coloration on here for me. It's not yellow enough. Somehow the silveriness is overriding the yellowness of the metal. So I'll just try that and see what happens, and hopefully with the reaction with the gunja seeds on top as well. And I'll get it really, really hot this time. That was another trick. He said, make sure that the general rule is when you think it's time to pour, wait another 5 minutes. So it could be I'm just being a little bit impatient. I mean, I don't often do ingots other than to prepare them for medicinal remedies. And of course, then we're not trying to do this. We're just literally pouring ingots that will then go through other processes.
Well, but you'd melt copper, and then you'd add the lead, and then you'd let it cool off, and then you'd heat it again, and then add the zinc? Or what would you do it the same sequence, or would you not cool it down in between, or what would you want to do there?
Again, I just said that I was using. I asked my friend about the metals we were using, so he said it's always a good idea to go from the hottest to the coldest. So start with the hottest. So if let's say we were doing iron would go in first, and then you'd have copper, and then you would add the zinc, and then finally the lead. So we're just doing the three. So we'll add the copper, and then he was saying put the zinc in, but almost at the same time the zinc goes in, then the lead goes in as well. Don't kind of pour it in between. Let it all go in, mix it, get it really, really hot, and then pour it quickly with these beans on the top.
So you'd be changing the sequence also, right? So before we had copper plus lead, and now you're doing copper plus zinc, let it melt, and then add the lead afterwards. And are you going to try putting the gunja, the jicquarity beans, like twice, like once when you put in the zinc, and then the second time when you put in the lead, or just once, or it's just all close to each other in time anyway?
As soon as the copper is melted, add the beans, and then that's it. They'll be still on the surface. They'll be happily bobbing away. They're quite fire resistant.
So you don't have it twice, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, let's try and find the source for the use of gunja. Try and see if we can find where this is mentioned, where this is described. But otherwise, just go forward with this slightly new ratios, slightly different sequence, and the use of these beans, and let's see what happens.
Now that we have worked out a good ratio of materials and an efficient sequence, we apply these to a batch of materials that have been purified. The Rasaprakāśasudhākara describes procedures for purifying copper, lead and zinc in chapters 4 and 5. The recipe for zinc purification in the Rasaprakāśasudhākara chapter 5 reads, melted and quenched in sour gruel or else in buttermilk or human urine or sheep urine, zinc will become properly purified. The recipe for lead purification in the 4th chapter reads, one should break down lead in the juice of turmeric and chaste tree. Thus lead becomes purified, and does not cause fainting, swelling, etc. The Rasaprakāśasudhākara's description of copper purification is vague, so we apply the same method as for zinc instead, using buttermilk. This method is applied in modern Rasa Shastra.